Hello, everybody, and it's a lovely morning here in Beijing. I also work on environment, and the air quality is good, so much better than a decade ago, I can't tell you. One of the important things about China is that things change all the time, and we're in an important moment in the COVID experience where I think the Chinese government is really trying to figure out how to make the next set of changes. So let me just sort of quickly start. China responded to COVID. I was here for SARS, and one of the things is China responded so much more quickly to COVID than to SARS. There was a lot of learning there. COVID just turned out to be way more infectious than SARS was, and also had this problem of asymptomatic infection that SARS didn't have. And then there were actually about 2 good years where the zero COVID policy really, really worked. And people here were feeling much freer and much more comfortable than people in the United States. But what happened is Omicron came in, and as everybody knows, probably and has experienced with Omicron, the period from exposure to infection is very, very short. And so even with a rigorous testing program, it's very difficult to catch and stop cases. And in China, people are not self-testing. They're lining up at testing stations all over the country. So you wait for a PCR test. Most of the time for Chinese citizens, that takes about 6 hours to get the result back, but that could have meant you were infectious for the last 24. So it's difficult to catch every case before they've exposed others. And that's the challenge that China is living with right now. They're in a situation where the vast majority of Chinese people have not had COVID. In the United States, we're up to maybe 70% of the population has actually had the disease, as well as a somewhat similar number has been vaccinated. In China, it's in the high 90%, 97, 98, 99% have not experienced COVID. And the vaccination rate is up to 92%. So people have been vaccinated, but they haven't been exposed in any way. And people don't know what COVID is like, and they're terrified of it. Now, that's not helped by the fact that if you get COVID, potentially thousands of people around you are forced into some kind of restriction. So the stigma here on the disease is really high, and part of the reason for the stigma is that getting COVID disrupts so many other people's lives. Sometimes a lot, sometimes a little. And one of the points I think I really want to get across is zero COVID is not one thing. Every city has its own separate app. Every city administers it differently. The data does not appear to move from one city to the other. So when I quarantined in Shanghai and came up to Beijing and I switched from the Shanghai app to the Beijing app, all my testing data disappeared for the last 10 days. And I started from zero again. So but that also means that some places have been stricter, some have been looser all along. There was a great article a couple of weeks by a guy who was living in the hills in Yunnan who had had 2 COVID tests in 3 years. And that sounded like it was what was going on in his community. On the other hand, there's another town in Yunnan that's been under lockdown for 2 continuous years. So a lot of it is about local officials. And even here in Beijing, it's what your district government does. The universities have different rules for themselves than even what their districts do. It's very, very local, and the experience of people is very, very different. I've met people here who have constantly been dealing with what's known as a pop-up, which is when your app that shows your COVID status suddenly has a message telling you that you need to quarantine or you need to test, or there's several different pop-up messages. I also have met lots of people here who've never had a pop-up. If you're lucky, many housing communities have never been under lockdown. If you work in an office that has never been under lockdown, if you don't travel, if you sort of have restricted your daily life to those two locations and a few others, maybe you've never dealt with it. The people I've met who mostly have had it really hard are the people who travel a lot. And people who travel a lot for work are constantly dealing with getting restricted. There's somebody I want to meet here who's texted me that he's stuck in Guangzhou and has no idea when he's getting out because Guangzhou has way more cases than Beijing. There was someone else I wanted to meet who was stuck in home quarantine and then had to travel. So she literally had no days in between those two events. So, but most of the people in the office that I work in, that's not their life. They just have been dealing with it on a regular basis. It does mean you have to line up every day. For most people, it's pretty short, but 2 days ago in Chaoyang district, which is the biggest district in Beijing, for whatever reason, they stopped funding the on-street testing centers. And so most of them were closed and the lines were around the block. Nobody knows why, because 2 days later they opened again. The rumor, at least, is that Zhang is currently testing a system where they don't do regular testing. Is that going to work? I don't know. Supposedly that also includes that people will start having to pay for their tests. I'm not sure those two policies go together in a very effective way. But what they seem to want to do right now is reduce the amount of testing over time, get that immunization rate up above 92%, try to mop up the last few people, and have more and more flexible systems. I think I experienced the flexibility the other day. I got a notification that I had been in a supermarket that apparently some exposed person had gone to. And instead of being told to stay at home for 3 days, I was just told to test for 3 days. So I think that's the kind of flexibility they're trying to bring in, but exactly where it goes, I don't know. The one last thing I did want to mention is I think the decline in US-China health cooperation is a really bad element for the future. It's not about COVID, it's about what happens next. Although, honestly, we need so much more research on antiviral treatments that anything that limits scientists working together is a real problem. As anyone who's ever had a virus knows, there's generally no medication for it. We now have Tamiflu for flu, and that really didn't become widely used until SARS, actually. And we have some COVID treatments, some, Paxlovid, which works quite well, some which don't work that well. We need a lot more. There's more viruses coming. They're not necessarily coming from China. I think that's a myth. People ignore Ebola, Nipah, Marburg. There's so many viruses out there. But a lot of the scientists who work on this and a lot of the great ones are here in China. Many of the others are in the United States. And the kind of mutual suspicion that's going on now, and especially the national security sort of restrictions and emphasis and scrutiny on scientists, especially of Chinese origin in the United States, is really hurting this effort. And that's something that I hope we can all speak up to our congresspeople, to our senators, and say, this really isn't a good idea. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Debbie. And now we'll turn the spotlight over to Dr. Yang to talk about the US-China relations bit of this topic. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Professor Zhang, and also Professor Takayama for inviting me to this very interesting event. And it's delightful to hear Deborah reporting from Beijing. And of course, to also explain the kind of frustrations and also the challenges in multiple respects. I do want to add to what Deborah just mentioned. Essentially, after China was able, of course, after the initial delay in Wuhan for more than 3 weeks, they were able to bring the virus under control by early April. So the Chinese leadership essentially came to basically, when the virus was spreading around the world, they decided very simply, we don't want to surrender the achievements we have made, because they knew firsthand how bad the situation was in Wuhan. So there was a lot of media reports of what happened in Wuhan, but also in the ensuing months and now years, tremendous attention in China of what has been happening around the world in terms of the number of people who have died, who have caught the disease, and of course the hospital overruns and so on that have been devastating in many communities. So this is one element of fear that has been providing the kind of popular basis for the zero COVID. The other aspect is that the Communist Party of China has a very top-down structure in many ways. Of course, there are local interests, horizontal differences, and so on. But when push comes to shove, the national leadership, when they really decide to pursue something, they actually have a lot of leverage to pull against the local authorities. So for the last 2.5 years in particular, local authorities have been under the threat of basically being losing their jobs for letting outbreaks go out of control. So this fear on the part of local officials has been the political foundation for continuing zero COVID. But of course, with Omicron, the situation began to change, as Deborah mentioned. And part of it is actually a decision by the Chinese leadership last year, actually sort of in the summer of 2021. Essentially, they decided we want to have a double guarantee, a double insurance policy. We have been able, China has been able to pursue a zero COVID policy. It has been effective. Let's continue that because we have been able to do it when other countries could not. They were really, really frustrated that other countries were either unable or unwilling to follow in China's footsteps in that regard. The other aspect was, of course, China very early on also developed its own vaccines, and they decided also that they were going to promote vaccination of the Chinese population. And when you have both vaccination and the zero COVID actually sort of pursued, clearly China would be in very good shape. Now, here is a little problem as we reflect on the situation. Namely, there is a paradox when you raise the level of vaccination. However, actually, the Chinese vaccinations are based on the inactivated virus version, and they tend not to be as good compared to the mRNA vaccines in cutting transmission, although mRNA vaccines have also become much less effective in cutting transmission. But the Chinese versions essentially do not work much in that regard. But when you do have vaccination, however, symptoms, when people become infected, symptoms begin to disappear or become much milder. In other words, they become much harder to be identified and quarantined and so on. And of course, when Omicron came or went to China in this case, and is much, much more infectious compared to the original, the wild type, it just became actually a perfect kind of a situation for the virus to escape. So since the beginning of this year, many Chinese cities have gone through frequent, repeated lockdowns, at one point covering hundreds of millions of people actually over the course of the year. And of course, now we've got Guangzhou and other major cities. The most striking situation was in Shanghai earlier this spring, especially in April and May. For 2 months, Shanghai actually was put under very strict draconian lockdown. In fact, it started so rapidly in terms of the lockdown. It was a hard lockdown from the very beginning, whereas in Wuhan, it took several weeks for the real lockdown to actually get into force. Now, here is the situation about Shanghai, and which actually relates to what Deborah was mentioning. Namely, Shanghai initially actually was experimenting with a targeted precision control approach to the virus. It actually was very successful for about 2 years, in fact, until, of course, at the end of March 2022, earlier this year, it begins to lose control. And of course, at that point, the local experts began to argue, well, actually the symptoms appears to be very mild, and we can potentially actually try to manage the situation in a way rather than impose a lockdown. In fact, they explicitly argued that Shanghai is the city for the entire country. We should not have a lockdown of the entire country because it's such a commercial and economic hub. And in the end, the Chinese national leadership decided to do so, to lock down the city. And of course, it took 2 months. And of course, many people at one point were starving practically. It's in this context, however, the Shanghai lockdown and the lockdown of cities around Shanghai really revealed the astronomical costs of such an approach. And of course, that really gave the Chinese leadership a lot to reflect on over the last few months. And they also learned from the experiences of Hong Kong and so on. And as a result, and this is actually why currently the situation is becoming very confusing, because it is confusing even for the top health officials at this very moment. Namely, the national leadership decided that the entire country should pivot to a precision control approach. Remember, the precision control approach failed in Shanghai. And as a result, there was the lockdown of Shanghai. And now they want the entire country to pursue it, even while they are still saying that, oh, we need to continue to be able to control the virus. The only logic to this approach now is essentially that China has pivoted it to a mitigation approach. In other words, they want local authorities to reduce the amount of lockdowns, to refrain from mass testing, to keep schools open, even when the number of cases actually go up. And they have been going up every day for the past 2 weeks now. So essentially, China finally has decided the cost to the economy and of course to society was so high. But most importantly also that the virus is not going away. So they have finally decided that this is the time. Now, they have not explicitly publicly stated so. So this is why it's so confusing even for the national health officials. Now, this actually does allow China, and this goes back to Deborah's earlier theme, because for the last almost 3 years now, it's been very difficult to conduct diplomacy with China because people were under lockdown. Travel was extremely difficult. I followed Deborah's travel from Shanghai to Beijing. Of course, you have to have a lot of patience and to be willing to be in quarantine for sometimes even weeks. I had one visiting scholar who was under quarantine for 4 months before she was finally allowed to go home. So as a result, actually, especially earlier when the US and China were really locked in mutual acrimony, it was very difficult for the two sides to think charitably of each other. But now, and especially with the summit meeting between President Biden and President Xi, of course, there is a joint working group that will be actually sort of working on public health issues from a global perspective. So finally, we are beginning to see actually some resumption of a working relationship between the two countries, even though it's very limited. However, the Chinese government has finally decided to lift or ease some of the travel restrictions internationally so that you can actually travel more easily. Even officials now, flights would not be arbitrarily canceled as easily, although we still have to wait and see. So we are looking for more interactions, more dialogue, and perhaps a little bit more goodwill as well, because the two countries have realized actually at the leadership level that however different the two countries are, there are a lot of things that we need to work together on globally. But at the same time, clearly this will take some time, especially after almost like China was in a form of self-isolation for the last 3 years. So it would take some time to open up. In fact, for many Chinese people, just being told, oh, you're not getting the PCR test anymore is very uncomfortable because they actually now fear that this is the indication the virus is everywhere, maybe. How am I going to be able to manage it and so on? On that note, let me turn back to Jack.
Great, thank you, Dali. Thank you for those insights and ending optimistic note on the prospects of U.S.-China relations thawing, I certainly hope that we go in that direction. So first question for both of you guys, maybe to take in turn, is I want to talk a little bit about public opinion, right? And how has the COVID-19 pandemic shaped public opinion in China, in the United States? How has it exacerbated sort of the underlying nationalist tendencies that were already brewing in these countries? And where might that go, and how might that create a hindrance, probably, right, for official level exchanges going forwards? Maybe we can have Dr. Seligsohn take that first, and then Dr. Yang.
So, as you know, I don't collect public opinion data, but I mean, obviously in the US, it's been really bad. And one of the huge problems has been the continuous pushing of the lab leak allegations with no scientific basis. And for anyone who still has questions, I urge you to just read the Warby et al. And Pekar et al. Articles that came out this spring in Science, which really put it to rest. The overwhelming probability is this came from a market, from the Huanan market itself. And the Warby one actually geolocates and graphs it, and it's really quite easy to follow. The Pekar one is super fancy math and science. But I think it's really had a long-standing impact in the US and has made the public just more skeptical, along with, of course, all of the sort of the way the Taiwan issue is discussed in the US. My impression here is actually a little different. I mean, so first of all, and it's based entirely on people in Beijing. And one of the things about all of these COVID policies is I'm not going to be traveling the way I usually do when I come to China and doing site visits and things, because if you leave Beijing, you may never get back. And so, and I actually have like a hard deadline. And then I thought maybe I'll just do a bunch of stops on my way out, but I have a hard deadline for getting back to teach next semester. So that's risky too, because I don't want to get stuck in some other city. So I'm basing it only on Beijing. But I would say, first of all, most people here are really like, why does the US hate us so much? I mean, that really is a big question right now, because I think most Chinese see their country as having never been an imperialist power, and which you have to have a different view of Western China than many people on the outside do. But people in China believe that it's been a specific landmass for many hundreds of years, and that is what it is, kind of thing, right? And so they don't see why it's perceived as aggressive overseas. And I'm not saying that's the only point of view. I'm just saying that's what most people see here. So they're very confused about why the level of rhetoric has ramped up so much. But the other thing I would say is they're also, especially among, academics and business people and stuff here, is people are feeling really isolated from the rest of the world, and they really want to get back in contact with the rest of the world. So I'm finding more interest, not less, in people meeting with me and talking about stuff and whatever, because I'm a novelty at this point. I first came to China in 1984, sort of a novelty back then, although, I was a young kid and didn't know anything. But then there were, a lot of years where Westerners were a dime a dozen and nobody really cared, which was fine. I thought that was China integrating into the world. That was great. But we're now back to the thing where any Westerner is like this very special representation of this world that China has not had much interaction with for the last 3 years. Dali is right. They've loosened up the rules a bit. The quarantine has gone from 10 days to 8 days. Now they'll say it was 7+3 and now it's 5+3. But actually that just means 8. But that's still probably too much. to resume business interaction. And, I listened to a dialogue with the heads of the AmCham and the OCham, the European Chamber, a couple of weeks ago, where they were saying this is the single biggest impediment to business. It's not IPR, it's not trade restrictions, it's not tariffs, it's not anything else. It's the fact that their CEOs can't travel here because CEOs don't sit in quarantine for 8 days. And they were saying without CEO travel, there's no new investment, because if a CEO can't visit the facility, they don't want it. So it's a huge impediment to international interaction, and people really want that. I think for a lot of other kind of interaction, if they could get it down to 5 days, that would even make a difference for academics and others. And then I did want to mention one other thing, is that the vaccine situation is also changing and improving. So first of all, the Chinese data on once people get a booster, so a three vaccine series is quite good. So they feel pretty good about their vaccines. The second is they're introducing new vaccines. At the moment, the one they're introducing is an aerosolized one. I had heard that they were launching a pilot in Shanghai, but I actually now know people who've gotten it in Beijing. I've also been told by one American doctor I really should try to get it before I leave because he thinks it's really good. So, and they're hoping, they don't know, that because it's an aerosolized one that you inhale, that it will actually reduce transmission. Because the reality is, as everybody in the US knows, the mRNAs no longer reduce transmission very much either. I mean, none of them are doing much on that. There are also several mRNAs in development here, one of which has already been approved for use in Indonesia, which is where they did their phase 3 trials. So this is not a static situation on that front, and it is one they're really working on. But I don't think it's particularly grim. I think it's looking okay.
Thank you, Dr. Yang. Yeah.
Yeah, let me try very briefly. Public opinion in both countries really deteriorated dramatically. American public opinion became much more negative towards China. It's never been this negative for the last 3-4 decades, essentially. In fact, Chinese public opinion equally went one way. Of course, on the one hand, in the US, there were the actually sort of accusations of lab leaks in China. In China, there was a lot of peddling of a rumor that the virus came from the United States and so on. So I don't want to go into all those details, but the point is, especially during the very bad pandemic stage, both countries were very much like gigantic echo chambers with elites, including diplomats who are heavily engaged in instigating those kind of rumors and so on. And it cannot be helpful when the media and all that were all jumping on those themes. And I think actually we are going into a different cycle as journalists began also to return to China, and they began to see what's happening and can report actually sort of on the other aspects of Chinese life. I do want to mention one striking statistic. Namely, there are still 300,000 Chinese students in the United States today. There are only 300 American students in China. It's that imbalance. I think Deborah is exactly right. The fact is, China has been very much in self-isolation for the last 3 years now. And of course, it's going to have an impact on people's views, and have been having a lot of dialogues and so on. It's really remarkable, because the biggest challenge to public opinion is when people do not know, they don't know.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Yang. Yeah, I certainly hope that we are at the beginning of sort of a cycle of reset, but I do worry that when you have public opinion in the US that's 80% unfavorable towards China, politicians take it as a sign that they can't really, right? They don't want to be soft. And so whether we can have a ratcheting down of cycles and tensions, right, is something that I'll be watching very carefully. Next, I want to turn to this question about counterfactuals, right? How might the pandemic response, right? Just talking about not about domestically, but about the diplomacy, right? US-China diplomacy over COVID. What would you say, how could it played out differently? Or another way to put the question, what would you say was the single biggest missed opportunity for how the US and China handled COVID diplomacy, in the last round? Whoever wants to take it first and take a stab at it. Biggest single missed opportunity.
Deborah, you want to get started?
Well, I mean, I guess my answer on most of these things is usually when, I guess it's the same as like everything else. If you're healthy yourself, you can help others. And I think the single biggest missed opportunity is that the US did not take the period of the Wuhan lockdown to get ready. That we actually had an opportunity to really prevent the catastrophe that happened in the US by really building up our track and trace system, getting our testing ready, and we just didn't do it. And I mean, I was shocked because I'd lived through SARS in China, and we had 40 US CDC people on the ground working with their Chinese counterparts, getting the track and trace system set up here. I mean, we were integrally involved. We know how to do this. And our federal system underfunding of the USCDC, I think some real failures of leadership at both CDC and HHS, coupled with denial in the White House, created a situation where our system got really bad, which of course caused a lot of people, including politicians, to look for someone to blame. So I really think that that's the key counterfactual, because I mean, the more I look at what happened here in China, I don't actually quite agree with Dali on the 3 weeks of delay, because I think some of it was actually some failures of Chinese testing. And I look at the speed, with which they managed to respond compared to the US, Italy, other countries. And they were dealing with a novel virus that they did not know what it was. And actually, we were told by the Chinese what it was. So I actually think the response here was extraordinary. And the number of missteps was less than you would expect, not more. But honestly, I was surprised by how badly we did in the United States. And it was funny because one of the first things someone here asked me when I finally got out of quarantine was those numbers about the number of Americans that died. That isn't true, right? That's just Chinese government propaganda. And I had to say, no, it's actually true. And then when I sort of translated the number into Chinese, and I was like, I was like, that can't possibly be true. And then I'm like, yeah, actually it is. A million just breaks the brain. So I don't know. I think we do best, just like I'm up on climate right now because we passed the Inflation Reduction Act. We do best when we take care of ourselves.
Well, yeah, those are very interesting comments. And I think actually, of course, the USCDC helped China develop a field epidemiology program and so on, beginning actually even before SARS in 2003. So in the sense that the USCDC, the failure, especially because it started, for example, Chicago had one of the first cases in the US, the fact that our system wasn't working as efficiently, in fact, had testing problems, really reflected better on China. However, I do want to mention that, in fact, the situation was that the outbreak started in Wuhan. Of course, when you are the first place that had that, clearly this was actually a new, what later was called a new disease. But at the same time, how it's handled really has massive consequences downstream. And of course, when you start with a relatively modest but significant number of cases of more than 40, at the beginning of January, not leveling with the public about what it was when people actually knew what it was. And in that case, actually, clearly China could have done much better. Of course, the Chinese leadership recognized that there were deficiencies and weaknesses in the response and have been trying to China has now launched a new National Administration of Disease Prevention and Control in order to enhance disease surveillance and so on. There were major mistakes in the process. Of course, in hindsight, it's easy to say, oh, you made some mistakes. I have actually spent the last almost 3 years now actually digging out exactly what happened. And of course, there were very significant judgment issues in the process. For example, in fact, it's not that the health leadership did not know what the disease was actually, and there are all sorts of issues. They simply avoided making any reference to a SARS-like disease. SARS, incidentally, in Chinese is called infectious atypical pneumonia. Well, if you apply that, you wonder actually what is this disease that had really actually sort of CT scans that looked very much like SARS. And that's how the clinicians first actually identified, began to report the first cases at the end of December. And also there were multiple genomic sequences available actually around that time as well. Now, what's really interesting, however, is in fact, the health leadership and the rapid response team from the China CDC, from the Hubei provincial CDC and municipal and district, there was a combined force. They were gathered at the end of December 2019, and they developed actually an action program that was very rigorous, but only for SARS. Now, some of the lessons of SARS were not learned because there were studies of SARS that did indicate that there were some asymptomatic transmission, but somehow that study was never published. Well, actually, it was published. It just didn't register on the experts' minds in a way. But most importantly, I think actually part of the issue, again, was really the lack of transparency that failed to alert the public that they could actually have taken significant measures. And in fact, one of the great challenges was by around January 10th, 2010, actually the leadership thought they had the outbreak under control. So of course, in hindsight, clearly there was something big that was happening, as we know, but yet somehow the system failed. Oh, let me actually end with one final comment, because especially given our reference to SARS. After SARS, China invested massively in building a national disease reporting system that later also incorporated a version also for example, atypical pneumonia as well. So there are notifiable diseases, including, for example, SARS, but also actually a separate system that actually is a associated program. That system was not activated for the reporting of the initial cases until the central leadership, central government had found out. In other words, the local authorities actually took their time instead of reporting right away, basically to sort of, so there were a lot of politics that's involved in the process of initial response and how they managed the information, what information was available as well. So clearly, the Chinese leadership has, on the one hand, they have been emphasizing how China has clearly been effective in controlling the virus in Wuhan. But at the same time, as the virus has returned to China in a different way, there is increasing also recognition that, well, initially there were significant weaknesses and deficiencies, and of course it's come to harm China as well.
Thank you, Dr. Yang. I know that you have to jump off at 7:50, so I hope we can work in one question for Dr. Seligsohn and then give you the last question, and then I'll give Dr. Seligsohn the last question for the session. I mean, weave in a audience member question here from Sylvia, which is building on something that I think, Debbie, you were saying earlier, which is if the US had different political leadership during the COVID outbreak, do you think the deterioration of US public opinion on China would have played out differently? In other words, maybe if not for the Wuhan virus, Kung flu sort of talk from President Trump, right, would things have played out differently?
You know, I would hope so. I certainly, could not imagine someone like President Obama saying anything indiscreet. On the other hand, I don't think it would be as different as we would want, though, because one of the things that was shocking is after Omicron, remember the Biden administration shut down travel from a bunch of Southern African countries. And it was obvious that Omicron was already elsewhere and that it wasn't even obvious that it arose in South Africa. Rather, South Africa is one of the countries like the UK that has particularly good sequencing, and so they tend to catch more novel viruses. So our tendency to punish those who tell us about new diseases has not gone away, nor is it restricted to China. So I tend to worry that that's, I mean, disease stigma is as old as time, and I think that was always going to be a problem. But I do think, I mean, if you think about the way President Bush went to a mosque after 9/11 and, you know, various things with the way President Obama acted, I think most other presidents would have tried to reduce the tendency to xenophobia instead of increase it. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. And last question for Dr. Yang before you have to hop off. This anonymous audience member asked a very poignant question about how to conquer the sense of hopelessness that's resulted from COVID. I think both within here in the US, but especially within China, right, where inside people can't get out, outside people can't get in. It's sort of this prison sense of environment that has, as you said, right, generated this echo chamber. Well, where's the future, right? Big question, right? Where's China headed after 3 years?
Well, Albert Camus in The Plague emphasized how essentially language matters. You need to really tell the truth, level with the people. If you look at what happened in Singapore, the Singapore leadership really did a great job in communicating with the people. And of course, John Barry, who wrote the Great Influenza book, also emphasizes how the government needs to earn the people's trust. And that, again, means sharing what actually the government intends to do. I think one of the big challenges today in China is that the government introduced a set of policies, but in fact, what is the intention is actually even the very senior leaders in the House leadership don't know, because somehow they are really doing it by indirection. But in fact, logically, the kind of set of policies that are being introduced are going to produce a set of consequences. And they should really share with people, explain how to best manage the situation, rather than simply say, oh, it's the local authorities' responsibility, and so on. I think, but again, though, leadership matters. And we need the kind of leadership that can connect with the people.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure.
Turning to another audience question for Debbie, is there any fear of vaccinations, vaccine hesitancy in China like there is in the US?
Yes. So fear about vaccine. So first of all, I mean, studies in the US suggest that like 20% of vaccine fear is people's fear of needles. So I would assume that the level of needle fear is pretty universal and is not sort of restricted to countries. So there's a view that a lot of people in the US who've come up with elaborate reasons why they don't want to get vaccinated, actually those are justifications for the fact that they really don't want a needle in the arm. And remember, most adults prior to COVID hadn't gotten a vaccination since they were a kid. They should get a flu vaccine every year. You should get a flu vaccine this year, but they don't. And so I think the needle phobia is sort of a universal baseline that's a problem everywhere, which is why things like aerosolized vaccines are an exciting addition. The other thing in China is there's been a lot of fear of bad vaccine and vaccine companies that play fast and loose. There was a big scandal with this when I was here in, I think it was 2018. And one of my friends got kicked off WeChat because there was sort of the mama web of mothers sort of sharing information about which vaccines were dangerous and trying to figure out if their kids had them. And it was like such a thing. So people start with skepticism, not only some people about vaccination, because of course, I think everywhere in the world, there's some fear of like strange things going into your body, but fear of the companies that produce them. And early on, there were several actual scandals that were actually in the Chinese media about companies selling fake vaccine. And my sense was that the Chinese government cracked down on it very hard, very fast, because they were worried about it. And I haven't seen much more of that lately. What's also interesting is apparently the Chinese vaccines are very non-reactogenic. In other words, you don't get a big pain in the arm or feel sick or whatever. And I've heard that now from doctors. So apparently that's actually true. But what it's caused a number of my friends to say to me is, I have no idea if I got a real vaccine or if they just shot saline in my arm because they didn't feel anything. So the fact that it actually turns out not to make them sick turns out to increase the skepticism rather than decrease it. So, but the thing is, for a lot of people, for school and employment, they've been told they have to get it. So there are a bunch of reasons why the percentage of working age people who've gotten it is higher than elderly. Although once you're at 92%, the percentage of elderly that's gotten it is reasonably high. But one of the reasons is because the standard mechanisms for forcing people to get it are much more effective for people who are sort of out and about in the work world than they are for the elderly, and especially for the rural elderly. The government doesn't really have many levers on them. I mean, if they say you have to stay in your village, that's what they do anyway.
All right, I'm going to try to fit in two questions here. So let's be brief in our answers to this first one, because I have another one for you. From Owen, so given that Trump has announced a re-election bid for 2024, what would a hypothetical another 4 years of Trump look like for U.S.-China relations?
And that's supposed to be the short answer?
Yeah, short one.
I mean, what I keep hearing, because I'm here mostly working on a climate change project. And so people keep saying, how can we trust that anything that the Biden administration is doing is going to stick because of Trump? And so I've been spending a lot of time explaining to people how laws are different than executive orders and much harder to change. So I think there's a lot in US policy that isn't going to change on issues. But I do think that's one of the big worries here that tamps down any enthusiasm about improving the relationship is, well, how long is this going to last? What's the Republican House going to do? This is a source of anxiety.
Thank you, Debbie. And I'll usurp my authority sort of as moderator to interject that I think despite massive differences, right, between the Trump and Biden administrations, foreign policy and domestic policies in other areas, on the China side, there's pretty remarkable continuity, actually. So the weird way to answer that question is maybe it won't change. I mean, we'll see. There's rumors that maybe the Biden administration will walk back some tariffs in a symbolic kind of gesture. This is what I work on and follow. And, if that changes, maybe the direction and tone will change a little bit after the summit. But up until now, the first 2 years of the policies are pretty darn similar. So final question for you, Debbie, and you alluded to this already. I think prior to COVID-19, right, I would have listed pandemic preparedness and public health as one of the areas of bright spots in US-China cooperation, right? And now, that definitely didn't pan out in this last pandemic. So what are lessons of the COVID-19 pandemic for prospects of the US and China working together to tackle other types of problems like climate change?
So, I mean, these problems are in many ways kind of the opposite of each other, because climate change requires mainly domestic action with some coordination. I mean, maybe that's true for pandemic preparedness too, right? So, I mean,
global public goods, right? I mean,
well, global public goods that require everybody to do their bit, right? I think the pandemic preparedness part requires a much greater attention to sort of health in developing countries. I mean, there's no reason to believe that the next pandemic is going to come from China. The next pandemic can come from anywhere, and most countries are actually in less good shape for identifying it and responding quickly than China, right? And if you look at how long it took the US to respond to the H1N1 outbreak, I mean, it turned out not to be nearly as serious as we thought it would, but it took us 8 weeks to gear up. The Chinese actually, fully geared up about 5 weeks after the disease emerged. So, most countries are just not that ready. And I do think we need to be working together and to support a more robust World Health Organization, where both the US and China have actually been impediments because we like our independence. So what's the lesson? And then for climate change, I just think, again, it's helping developing countries is where we have to work together. On mitigation, our own domestic work is what's really going to help them the most, right? That by reducing our own emissions, we reduce the impact everywhere. But there's a lot of adaptation that needs to happen because climate is getting bad at a much worse rate than people predicted it would 20 years ago, right? Fires in the West, floods everywhere. And developing countries really need financial assistance now, and that's what the big fights are in the international negotiations. And the US and China have both been impediments to that. The US because our Congress doesn't like to give money to other countries, and the Chinese because they still want to say, well, we're not the historically biggest emitter. Although I believe if you run the numbers now, pretty soon they will be because their current emissions are so high. So, in this loss and damage fight, the Chinese are getting attacked at the UN more strongly than the US, but the US isn't doing a whole lot. So I think we need to be talking about how to be more proactive in both countries.
Great. Thank you, Debbie. I really liked your earlier insight about if either the US and China, they need to get their houses in order domestically, and that helps with the international cooperation bit. And I think that applies both to, pandemic preparedness and to climate. That wraps up our programming for the evening. I'm going to hand the spotlight back to Melissa Miller from the World Trade Center, Kansas City, to close us out. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jack. Thank you, Debbie, for joining us tonight, and everyone from the University of Kansas Center for East Asian Studies, and Dr. Dali, who had to leave us early. But it's my pleasure to close out tonight's event on behalf of World Trade Center Kansas City and the International Relations Council, who also unfortunately could not be here tonight because of a prior engagement. But real quickly, at World Trade Center Kansas City, our mission is to connect, educate, and provide resources to the regional business community in order for them to achieve international trade success. Partnering with organizations on events like this is very helpful for businesses to really grasp the scope of international trade in context of foreign relations and what that looks like. And the International Relations Council, I do want to mention, they strengthen Kansas City's global perspective by maintaining an active dialogue around world events, global issues, and their impact on our communities. Of course, this is right up their alley. They invite you to learn more about the International Relations Council, including their upcoming events. They do a lot throughout the year, and how to join IRC as a member if you're not already. And you can find them online at irckc.org. Again, thank you everyone for joining us for both the national broadcast and our local panel. We look forward to hosting you at future events.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Melissa and Akiko. All right, that's a wrap.